Nice. So I don't know how all y'all's morning went. Ours went really well. We got up, got dressed, did breakfast, cleaned up the whole 9 yards, straightened everything out, got all our books and everything, sat down. Come on in. Sat down in the car, got out. All right, it's time to go. Pack up everything. Sat down in the car. Car turns on. When the car turned on, then it it's hooked up to my phone. It was connected to my phone, and immediately I looked in it. We usually try to leave about 8:30, which was about the time we were leaving, and for some reason the thing said 7:30, and I thought, and so Debbie got in the car and saw that it said 7:30, and she thought, well, that can't be right, and she pulled her phone out to check her phone time, and I'm like, well, my watch says 8:30. And it's 8:30. All the clocks, her watch says 8:30. All the clocks in the house say 8:30. And then Debbie, so we're sitting there, right? Now it's we got to go because church is starting and class is starting in 30 minutes. And Debbie asks the question, is today time change day? I'm like, I don't know. I haven't heard a thing about time change this week. Usually, you see it or you hear it or whatever. And it's like, I haven't heard a thing, seen any announcements or anything about it being time change week. And so we sitting there in our driveway, Googling time change day. And sure enough, today is time change day. So now we're sitting there an hour and a half before we need to, like, so what do you want to do? Kind of thing. Do we want to go to the church? I thought about going somewhere, but at that point, it's kind of, get there and then you sit down and get something and you have to get back up again and quickly. And so I said, we could go. I said, I have an office we can sit in now. She says, I kind of want to sit in your office. It's like, okay. Nobody wants to sit in the principal's office, not even her, kind of thing. So we just went back into the house and sat down and read a bit and putzed a bit and then got back in the car. So, all right. Well, good morning. Welcome back. Happy November. So we are into November. Yeah, I'm not. So happy birthday, Rebecca. Happy birthday, Ed. Happy birthday, Bonnie Kerr. Happy birthday. Well, Friday was Tom Paxton's birthday, for those that keep track of that kind of stuff. I know, you're thinking, who's Tom Paxton? Well, he's an 88-year-old folk singer kind of thing, kind of a legend in the folk universe. But November 2nd is a red letter day. Today is the day in 1600 that Richard Hooker died. Richard Hooker died. One of the great English nonconformist church leaders. And when he died, his last written words were, God hath my daily petitions, for I am at peace with all men, and he is at peace with me, and this witness makes the thoughts of death joyful. So that was it. On this date, 1600, Richard Hooker died. On this date in 1637, the trial began for Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson, one of the great colonial female leaders, who was not at was what happened was she was teaching Bible studies in her house, right? So she would get a couple of women to teach Bible studies in her house, and then a few more women came, and then a few more women came, and then they brought their husbands, and soon Anne Hutchinson in her house had more people than the church did. And so that was a problem for the church, considering this was pretty much a church government. I mean, it was a church. That whole, the colonialists were very much in favor of a church-controlled state. Okay, and so they said, well, you can't be doing that. So they put her on trial for antinomianism, not following the law, and she was convicted and kicked out of the colony, and she went to Rhode Island, which was founded by Roger Williams. Roger Williams, the first person generally considered to be the first Baptist in the colonies. So that all started on this date in 1637. Massachusetts. King Philip's War started on this date in 1675. King Philip's War is still the most violent war per person in U.S. history. What means is that the number of casualties relative to the number of inhabitants. So more people were injured or killed during King Philip's War than any war since then, including World War II, Vietnam, any of those. That was in this. There's an interesting book about it by a guy named Nathaniel Philbrick, where he talks about what it was all about. King Philip is an Indian, so he was an Indian. But speaking of wars and the like, in 1783, George Washington left the army. He left the army. Now, this was a significant thing because nobody expected him to. They kind of expected that because he was the conquering general for this new country, they needed a leader, and everybody kind of thought that he would just sort of become the generalissimo of the new world, of this new country, the United States of America. But he did not. He left. One of his he was the Cincinnatus. It's a play. I forget who wrote it. It's a Roman play about a Roman general named Cincinnatus, where we get the city Cincinnati from, who left. And the idea was somebody who could leave power was just sort of a, wait, you left? You just stepped down? If you've ever, and then he goes in to become, and then 4 years later, because there was the Articles of Confederacy, that ran the country from 1776 to 1787. And there was a president under, I think it's John Randolph, I forget the guy's name, who, every once in a while you'll get one of these people who think it's a real super gotcha moment because I just saw a meme about this the other day. Oh, these guys think George Washington was the first president. They don't know their history. It's like, please, get a life, will you? But be that as it may, so under the Constitution, George Washington was the first president. He came in, this would have been in 1788, he becomes the president, goes for 2 terms, and then leaves, which again, nobody expected him to do that, but he did. He left power. He walked away from power, and that was the picture of how the U.S. presidency was viewed. That 2 terms, and you were done. Until Roosevelt took care of that. So there was no law up until Roosevelt that said the president had to step down after 2 terms. There was no term limit law on the president. Any president up until Roosevelt, and including Roosevelt, could have run for as many terms as they wanted. Roosevelt was the first one to run for a 3rd term and then for a 4th term. And then it was after Roosevelt got out of office that the Republicans who took over under Eisenhower said, it was Truman, and then when Eisenhower was president, the Republicans were in charge of Congress. They said, you know what, let's change the Constitution. We don't want any more 3-term presidents. And so they changed the Constitution in 1955 or something like that to ensure that didn't happen again. So there you go. That was your history lesson for today. In 1898, Theodor Herzl arrived in Jerusalem. Theodor Herzl is considered the founder of what's referred to as Zionism. Okay, Zionism. He wrote a book called The Jewish State, and it was driven in part by the Dreyfus Affair. There's a movie coming out about the Dreyfus Affair. Is anybody familiar with the Dreyfus? I have talked about it before, but there was a not a general, but a Jewish officer in the French army was framed for a crime that he did not commit. That's pretty much the definition of being framed. But yeah, and it turned out that it was mostly because he was Jewish that he was framed. And Herzl was a journalist at that time watching the Dreyfus Affair, and he came to the conclusion then that the idea that the Jewish people could assimilate into other societies was just not going to work. So up until that point, what we call the Holy Land, Palestine, the Levant, was controlled by the Ottoman Empire, which would be Turkey, that area of Turkey, it was Islamic controlled, had been for 500 years. Um, and he was the one that said, the Jewish people need a homeland. And so they settled on Israel, what we call Israel today. Although there were some talk about like moving into a section of South America, but they just figured Israel was because there weren't a lot of Jews living in Israel at that time, in Palestine at that time. There really weren't. I think the number is somewhere between 5 and 20,000, something like that. But he wrote this book called The Jewish State, advocated for Zionism, created Israel Fund. There's a name for it. I can't remember the exact name for it. Started raising money, and basically over the next 20 or 30 years, the Jewish Fund started buying land every time they would sell it in Israel. Just kept buying and buying and buying and buying land. Helped in part because it was on this date in 1917 that England issued what's called the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration, Lord Balfour was the Foreign Secretary, and the Balfour Declaration is simply a piece of paper that's signed that said it is our Majesty's or Her Majesty's, His Majesty's intent that the Jewish people will have their own homeland in Palestine. And so going from that really set Zionism up, and so they just kind of went nuts in terms of buying land, just buying land. And this was coming at the end of World War I, and one of the things that happened as a result of the end of World War I was the Ottoman Empire fell. When the Ottoman Empire fell, the British took over Palestine. That's why you have what's called the Palestinian Mandate years. This has nothing to do with David, but well, actually it does, because David, Jewish, King David Hotel, the whole 9 yards. But then in 1948, after World War II, Israel was declared a state. Now I say all that. Now you think, well, why are you saying all of this kind of stuff? Because I said my next thing I'm going to talk about is dispensationalism. And the nature and definition and creation of the Jewish state is an integral corollary of dispensationalism. It's kind of one of the adjacent to it. So that's why I said all of that, because it's going to come back. It's all going to come back, and so I'm going to ask you about it. But finally, it was on this date. Anybody know what happened on this date in 2016? This was the date, November 2nd, 2016. This was the date that the Chicago Cubs won the World Series. Where were you on this date? 2016. All right, we are in 2 Samuel chapter 24, the final chapter of the book of Samuel. Again, when I say the final chapter, we all know that the chapters and the books divisions are not unique to the book itself. So there are no chapter divisions in the actual book of Samuel. There are no verse divisions in the actual book of Samuel. In fact, the actual book of Samuel is a single book. It isn't two books. It was separated into two back in when they did the Septuagint, because it took too much paper to write. It couldn't fit on a single scroll. So they put it on two scrolls, and it's the first scroll of the book of Samuel and the second scroll of the book of Samuel. Later, when it got translated over, it became 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel. Same thing with Kings, same thing with Chronicles. Ezra and Nehemiah were a single book. In the Hebrew Bible, it says why the Hebrew Bible has 22 books, and the English Old Testament has 39. Why is that? Well, Ezra and Nehemiah are a single book. The minor prophets are a single book. And there's one other in there. I think Lamentations is part of Jeremiah or something like that. I can't remember what the other, something. There's another book that's combined in there. But we talked about how this works as far as the literary structure of the book, that the story of David, as the writer of Samuel puts it, kind of ends at chapter 20. Okay, so David has returned from Absalom's revolt. He's got that little revolt with Sheba, and he's kind of settled back into Jerusalem. David is the king. And then starting with chapter 21, we have this odd series of circumstances, starting with the story of the Gibeonites, where there's a plague or there's a famine. And he says, well, what happened? So, oh, it's because of something Saul did. We talked about that. And he said, well, you need to give up several members of Saul's family. And David does. And 7 members of Saul's family are killed and left on rocks to weather and to be exposed. And one of the daughters, remember that whole story kind of thing? So that was, and we talked about a chiastic structure where things balance off each other, okay? And so this story, when we talk about numbering the fighting men of Israel, measures against or is balanced against that first story in chapter 21, okay? So previously we learned that this is part of an epilogue by Samuel, and the chiastic structure puts this story in contrast to chapter 21. And we'll talk about why those two are in common when we get down to it, okay? So in chapter 24, beginning with verse 1, the story starts with the Lord being angry at Israel, okay? So again, you could look at this, and people look at this and say, okay, this is the last thing in David's life. He's an old guy, he doesn't realize what he's got. You could do that, okay? It doesn't really fit the literary structure. It's like this is something that took place during the reign of David. Okay, we don't know exactly when, but it's, there are some indicators of when it took place. But to me, I think it's just, hey, you forgot, somebody, some later editor, or perhaps the person who is writing the book looks at it and says, oh, there's an afterword. Maybe I should have thrown this story in. I'll just throw it in as an afterword. Every once in a while, you'll read a book like where the epilogue says, well, what about this? Or here's, one other story. There's what, kind of what happened to these guys, sort of stuff. But again, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel. So the story starts with the Lord being angry at Israel, and the reason for the Lord's anger is unknown. We don't know why the Lord is angry, although it is almost certainly having to do with some sort of Torah observance, that they're not following the law in one way or the other. There's plenty of other examples through the Old Testament and Samuel where the Lord is angry at something. In fact, in chapter 21, the balanced story, the Lord is angry because there's a famine. If we start in chapter 21 and we look at that passage, during the reign of David, there was a famine for 3 successive years, so David sought the Lord. So there's this famine. Why is there a famine? Well, because of this thing that you have done. So here in chapter 21, it starts with the Lord being angry. David finds out why. Okay, now here, we never really find out why the Lord is angry with Israel. Okay, but he is. Again, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, go and take a census of Israel and Judah. So the Lord incites David against Israel. That is them, the people there, okay? The Lord incites David against Israel, okay? Now this is kind of interesting. This is an interesting passage or interesting idea. Wait a minute, what? Because now what's going to happen, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen is he's going to do this census, and then he's going to realize I shouldn't have done this census, and then he's going to get punished, and Israel's going to get punished because of this census, okay? But here, wait a minute, the text seems to suggest that it's the Lord's fault that David does this census in the first place, right? I mean, it says the Lord incite David to go count the people, okay? Now, there's a couple of ways to look at this, okay? One way is to say, well, yeah, God did. So, or you could look at other examples in the Bible, and you look at it from the author. There's kind of a theological explanation in that it happened, the Lord is sovereign, therefore the Lord allowed this. Or in that he created the situations, he caused this. Okay, now I don't have a thing there's no line for that, but that's kind of the sovereignty point of view to say, well, this has happened because the Lord anything that happens has happened. And okay, and people do that. Everything that happens is because the Lord wanted it or allowed it, however you parse your words to describe it. Now, there's a couple of examples. Now, think about the story of Job. Okay, think about the story of Job. from Job's point of view, now one of the things about Job, and I've talked about Job in here in previous lifetimes, but in one of the things about the story of Job is that Job never gets an explanation about what's going on. You know, I mean, we know, right? We see behind the scenes. We know that the accuser is up there talking to uh, to, to the Lord and saying, "You consider Job." So it's like, okay, well, why does well, God says you can do this, you can do this, you can do this. Okay, what about the Lord hardening Pharaoh's heart in Genesis and Exodus? Okay, what about the Lord hardening Pharaoh's heart? Again, this is looking at it from this sovereign point of view. This that the Lord is in charge of everything, so it happened under His watch. Therefore, the Lord caused it, kind of thing. Okay, does that make the Lord guilty of this? Well, that's therein lies your conundrum. I say no, but others have looked at this and said this is a bad deal. Now, there's another interesting way to look at this, and this is to me it's a really fascinating translation question here. Now I haven't talked a lot about Chronicles, the book of Chronicles in here. Okay, so we have three major historical books in the Old Testament. We have these historical books. We have Samuel, we have Kings, we have Chronicles. Okay, so Samuel was what we've been in, which talks about the house of David. Okay, it's Samuel, then it's Saul, then it's David. Okay, it ends when David ends for all practical purposes. Okay, Kings talk about the kings of Israel, all of the different kings of Israel, and it's kind of a political, and it goes through the whole from the death of David to the end of the kingdom. Okay, so it kind of fits, bookends with Samuel. It's a different writer, different emphasis. Okay, but that's the book of Kings. Now the book of Chronicles, okay, is written later. Okay, and it tells the whole story of the kingdom, starting from Saul all the way to the end. And in fact, the end of Chronicles, the last chapter of Chronicles, is the same as the first chapter of Ezra. It just goes right into Ezra and Nehemiah. So one of the big arguments about the who wrote Chronicles is, well, Ezra wrote Chronicles because Ezra was a scribe, right? Is Ezra the scribe or Nehemiah the scribe? One of them was a scribe. Ezra was a scribe, so it just kind of makes sense. He's a natural there to say that Ezra wrote Chronicles, and so he's got this whole. So this is written again. It's written and includes every king all the way to whoever the Ahaziah or something like that. I forget who the last king is. All the way to the end. So Chronicles is written much later, but it includes a lot of the story of David. Okay, so this is a story of David written much later. Okay, so if we look at, and First Chronicles includes this story. So if we go to First Chronicles chapter 21, telling the same story, same event, same discussion, it starts off, verse 21, Satan rose up against Israel and incited David to take a census of Israel. Now that's a kind of a difference. Okay. So now some look at this and say, well, clearly, either the Lord is Satan or you've got a contradiction on your hands here. And the interesting thing is, I mean, the NIV translates says the anger of the Lord burned against Israel. Okay, how many of you have a translation in First Chronicles where it says Satan? How many of you are holding a translation where it says Satan rose up and did this? Anyone? Okay, 1, 2. See, so which is it? Do we have a contradiction? Well, okay. I mean, you could argue that, I suppose. Okay, the question is the word Satan. Okay, the word Satan. What does the word Satan mean? Okay, now it's something like 50. There's, if you ever go to, has anybody ever gone to Bible Gateway? it's a website, and you can look up a verse, and you can tell what translation you want it in, and it'll show the verse, and then in whatever translation. So I want to see it in the NIV, because to me the NIV is the inspired Word of God. I'm kidding. That's a joke. I'm going to edit that out, kind of thing. But it's but then you can see it, and it'll say, do you want to see it in all translations? And it'll just blast out that verse in like 55 translations. And 50 of the 55 translations of First Chronicles say this is Satan. Now, say Satan incited David. Okay. So the question then becomes, what happened here? What changed? So am I suggesting that 50 out of 55 translations got it wrong? Yes, that's what I'm saying. Okay, here's why. Here's the point. And again, if you wanted to say, well, here's a contradiction, okay, have a nice day, see you later. But what does the word Satan mean? Now, the word Satan is used, the Hebrew word Satan or Hasatan is used in Samuel and Chronicles a couple of times, and it's often, well, every other time, it means adversary. Okay, so if you remember, there's this scene when David is coming back from exile, right? So David, not from exile, from Absalom. After Absalom, he meets up with Ziba. Ziba? Forget who he meets up with. But Abishai is with him. And Shimei meets up with Shimei. And remember, on his way out, Shimei is throwing stones at him and saying, get out of here, you're a bad guy, you bad person. And then once David has won back his role, Shimei is back saying, seriously, David, I was just kidding. It's okay, everything's okay, we're good, right? And Abishai there, Joab's brother, is at David's side. Abishai, who we learned was one of the 30, right? One of the 3, actually. And he says, or it's top of the 3. Well, one of David's mighty men. Abishai is like, David, why are you taking this from this guy? Let me just kill him. Let me just kill him and get out of his way. And David says to him in Hebrew, who made you Satan today? Who made you the accuser? Who made you the adversary? Kind of thing. Okay? So that's what the word means. That's what the word is used for. Okay? So why do we have it? Why is it translated Satan? It's translated Satan mostly because in most of the manuscripts there isn't a definite article. And so they figure, and this would be the first time that Satan this is referred to as an individual. This is the argument that goes. Okay, but it doesn't have to be. It's still the word itself in Hebrew is a position. Okay, it's a role. Okay, is Satan talking to God in heaven about Job? Okay, well, if you say yes, because the text says Job and Satan consider my servant Job, well, that's what the text says. Well, then you got a problem about, okay, well, what happened to this whole God can't be in the presence of sin and the holiness of God and Satan? And that's kind of, until you say, okay, what is Satan? Is Satan a person? Or is this word, as it's translated in Hebrew, is this a position? Okay, and I think it's a position. Okay, it's a role. Okay, so somebody playing the role of adversary. And in the New Testament, as they develop theology and how creation works, and they realize, hey, wait a minute, there is a single point of opposition where they use Satan in the Greek as a proper name for that leader of the opposition. Okay, meaning the devil and Beelzebub and all of that. Okay, so the idea is someone from First Chronicles, when they say the First Chronicles translator probably is looking at it and looks at it and knows what happened, right? He's read the stories. He's got Samuel with him, and he recognizes the same thing we all recognize, that it's not the optics aren't good on the Lord inciting David to do this. And so how can I better explain this? And he says, well, it wasn't the Lord inciting David, it was an adversary. And he uses the word adversary that we later translate as Satan. So a better way to look at what happened is someone, probably a foreign ruler, started taunting David, and David is suddenly getting a little worried. We don't know. I need to know how big my army is. And over time, we see the word Satan. We don't see the word, we looking back in 2025, we don't look back and see, okay, an adversary. We see Satan, we think, oh, Beelzebub, prince of the power of the air. Okay. Here, it's more likely that it's an adversary. Now, if it is an adversary, then you could say, do we ever see in the Bible where the Lord raises up other nations to fight against David, to punish them for something? Yes, we see it all the time. So if you think about this as a position, as just somebody who is fulfilling a role, an adversary, and that adversary came in under the knowledge of God. God is using this person to judge Israel. So which king was it? I don't know. Could have been King Tim. He's like that. Just said, you know what? Maybe he's massing on the border, and David, in a show a lack of faith, rather than inquiring of God what he should do, he says, you know what? I need to know how many fighting men I've got. Okay. So, any questions on that? So to me, the Lord is using another nation. The Lord is using another nation to incite, to cause David into this. David's result is he counts the men rather than trusting in God. Hence, the result of the rest of the story as it follows through. Okay, so the instructions from God are go and take a census. Go count the fighting men. So the king said to Joab and the army commanders with him, go throughout the tribes of Israel from Dan to Beersheba. Okay, and again, Dan is the Dan is the furthest north part of Israel, and Beersheba is the farthest south part of it. So when they say go from Dan to Beersheba, it's like saying, yes, I've seen the United States from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Okay, so it's like just the same, Dan to Beersheba, Atlantic to the Pacific. Okay, sort of thing. And he says, go throughout the tribes of Israel from Dan to Beersheba and roll the fighting men so that I may know how many there are. Okay, so there is a possibility that what what God wants him to do, or what the adversary wants him to do, some have argued that, oh, well, David is changing the rules. But if you think about it as an adversary coming in to do the fight, well, then it makes sense. I need to know how many fighting men I have. How big is my army? See, so instructions from God to David are go and take a sentence. And like a good manager, David delegates the job to Joab and others. He says, okay, I'm going to take care of this. Joab, go count the people. Go count the fighting men. Take a bunch of your guys with you. Go around the nation and count the fighting men. Okay. Joe, has anyone counted the people before? Have we seen counts of the people before? Yes, we have. So again, why is it a problem here? And I think it's a problem here because there's an adversary threatening David, and rather than trusting God, he's like, well, how big is my army? Let me see whether I need to trust God or not. Let me check this out. I may not need to bother God with this one. I can take care of it. Which is kind of exactly the same thing that the Israelites did once they went into Israel. Once they crossed the Jordan originally, they took over Jericho, and then they were going to get Ai, and there's not a lot of inquiring of God. They said, don't worry, we got this one. This is a small town. We can take care of this. Okay, so says, where am I here? Like a good manager. So yeah, they've counted them before, but this time, the situation was such that David should have just inquired of the Lord and said, should I go up? Again, he's done that before. Should I go up against them? God says yes. God says no. Okay. Instead, David says, let me see if I need to bother God with this. So Joab, interesting. Joab, like a good employee, questions David. Those of you managers, it's kind of a good employee questions David. But I think it's interesting. Joab, of all people, when I think of, you know, godly leaders in Israel, Joab does not come to mind. Okay, just not in my, these are the guys we want on our wall, and yeah, be like Joab. It's like, I don't know, man. Joab had some issues, right? But Joab recognizes that something is wrong here. So like when Joab says it's bad, yeah, like even Joab knows this is a bad idea, David. Okay, but he says, why does my so like, may the Lord your God multiply the troops 100 times over, and may the eyes of my Lord the king see it. Job is like, listen, I want us to have a huge army. I want you to see how big your army is and how successful your army is. But why does my Lord the king want to do such a thing? I want you to have a large army, but why do you need to have it proven to you? Joab is like, this may not be the best idea, right? The king's word, however, overruled Joab. Okay, this is when that's whatever the Stand translation of this said. The king said, "Because I said so." It's in the Hebrew there somewhere. Because I said so. Don't ask, just because I said so. Okay, and that usually, I shouldn't say usually, but if you think about it in the employee-boss relationship, that often doesn't end well. When the boss comes in and says, do this thing, and the employees who are doing the actual work say, that's not a good idea for any number of reasons. And so then they question him and say, that's not a good idea. It says, hey, I'm the boss, do it. Doesn't often end well. Sometimes it does. It has ended well, but not often. Okay? I should say not always. Okay? The king's word, however, overruled Joab and the army commander, so they left the presence of the king to enroll the fighting men of Israel. After crossing the Jordan, they camped near Aurora, south of the town in the gorge, and then went through Gad and on to Jezmar. They went to Gilead in the region of Tadam Hadshi, and then on to Dan Jan and around toward Sidon. Then they went toward the fortress of Tyre and all the towns of the Hivites and the Canaanites. Finally, they went to Beersheba in the Negev of Judah. So basically, if this is Israel, you got the two lakes. Jerusalem is right about here. Basically, they went across the Jordan, up here, down here, boom, 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 back up. Yes, I know. Take a picture. You can sell it as an NFT, non-fungible token. Actually, it looks kind of like a guy that's crying, isn't it? Sort of kind of thing. So the job, a counterclockwise tour of Israel, lasts 9 months and 20 days. Okay. After they had gone through the entire land, they came back to Jerusalem at the end of 9 months and 20 days. Now, I have no idea why they picked 9 months and 20 days. There's a reason, but I don't know what it is. I thought gestation period, but 9 months, I don't know, that's a long gestation period. If somebody has been pregnant for 9 months and 20 days, they are not a happy person. I can tell you that much. Okay. But then it's like, that doesn't really seem right. I tried to figure 9 months. I was like Googling 9 months, 20 days, or figured out the days, 180, 200, 200 days. So, 9, 30 days. But then again, Hebrew months were different. So, what it's, I don't know. To me, there's something about the time, but I don't know what it is, because, I think everything is put down for a reason. That, the original readers would have gotten, oh yeah, that's how long something else took, kind of thing. But regardless, we have a time. Joab reported the number of fighting men to the king. In Israel, there were 800,000 able-bodied men who could handle a sword, and in Judah, 500,000. Okay, so what that does tell you is that Judah is fairly significant size relative to the rest of Israel. Okay, it's about 40%, 35, 40% of all of the fighting men of Israel are in Judah. Okay. So David is conscious. Okay, so the job, a counterclockwise tour of Israel, lasts 9 months, 20 days. And immediately, once he gets this, once he gets this, verse 10, David was conscience stricken after he had counted the men. And he said to the Lord, I have sinned greatly in what I have done. Now, Lord, I beg you, take away the guilt of your servant. I have done a very foolish thing. Okay. So again, if you think that David, he realizes, he either realizes it could be, now there may be information that we don't know. Well, there is, but there may be a key fact. It may be that the person that's inciting this other general or other king, has 2 million men in his army, 10 million men in his army. He realizes he's hopelessly outnumbered. And now he hasn't trusted in God. He realizes now I have to trust in God. And it's like, wait a minute now, he should have just, because again, David, 600 men were pretty effective when they were in God's plan. So David could have been effective right from the get-go. But for whatever reason, David realizes right away, maybe because he's had 9 months and 20 days to think about it. He's like, okay, this was a mistake. I should not have done this. This was wrong. This was wrong. This was wrong. And when the numbers come in, something about the numbers say, ooh, this was a mistake. I shouldn't have done this. Okay. And he says, I have sinned greatly. Okay. So David is conscience stricken when the count is finished. Okay. He says, I have sinned. Okay. And just for the record, this is not the first time David finds himself in this situation where he's telling the God, I have sinned. Okay. But I have done a very foolish thing. Kind of thing. So, I mean, you give it to David. I mean, he recognizes his role here and his responsibility, his culpability in this. But he said, I have done, he says, I beg you, take away the guilt of your servant. Okay, I'm the one, I have done he's taking responsibility for this. Okay. The trouble is David brought a lot of people in on this. He sent his army out, or he sent his army commanders out to do this. Everybody was counting on this. No pun intended there, but this was going to be some big information. Before David got up the next morning, the word of the Lord had come to Gad the prophet, David's seer. Now we've seen Gad before, but this is the first time he comes in a big way. So God talks to Gad the prophet. Now notice he's not talking to David. Okay, so I mean, rather than God speaking to David, which we've seen prior, where David is the writer is making it clear that David and God are, talking to each other. This time, and this is what makes me think that David's problem is he should have just inquired of God and said, okay, what do I need to go win this battle, instead of counting his people. So God says, okay, well, I'll tell you what, you're not going to talk to me. I'm not going to talk to you. I'm going to get this prophet to come and talk to you. So Gad the prophet, David's seer. So now God is talking to the prophet. Go and tell David, this is what the Lord says. I am going to give you 3 options. Choose one of them for me to carry out against you. Okay. So, maybe David is hoping, okay, you're going to hit me in the head, you're going to hit me in the arm, you're going to hit me in the leg, one of those 3 options against you. But no, it's not quite. Gad went to David and said to him, shall there come on to you, make sure here, David gets 3 options, famine, war, or plague. Shall there come on you 3 years of famine in your land, or 3 months of fleeing from your enemies while they pursue you? Maybe this guy who's inciting this whole thing is the one that's going to, maybe I'm just going to let this guy in over the border. That's happened before. The Lord has used other nations to judge Israel. Or 3 days of plague in your land. Now then, think it over and decide how I should answer the one who sent me. Now, can you imagine being David right there? Talk about your executive decisions. I want to be in the big chair. I want to make the big decisions. Okay, there you go, David. Knock yourself out. Go ahead. Which one are you going to choose? And interestingly, he only excludes one. Okay. He says, David said to Gad, I am in deep distress. Let us fall into the hands of the Lord, for his mercy is great, but do not let me fall into human hands. Okay. So he rules out war. Don't want to have war. Okay. So the Lord sent a plague on Israel from the morning until the end of the time designated, and 70,000 of the people from Dan to Beersheba died. Okay, so that same route, that same phrase from north to south, 70,000 people died. When the angel stretched out his hand to destroy Jerusalem, the Lord relented concerning the disaster and said to the angel who was afflicting the people, enough, withdraw your hand. Okay, so there's the God can send people around Israel too. Okay, so again, compare this to like the Passover, right? Where God says this is what's going to happen: the firstborn is going to die, and the angel of the death comes in, and there you go, right? But at some point, Dave, that maybe he started, maybe he went to, I kind of like in my head, was taking the same route, and he gets to Jerusalem and says, all right, now I'm going to take care of Jerusalem. Okay, and the Lord says, stop. That's enough. We've made our point. That's enough. The angel of the Lord was then at the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite. When David saw the angel who was striking down the people, so again, this is in Jerusalem, right? He's very near Jerusalem and kind of on the north side. And he says, stop. And David sees this. Okay, now I don't know how this worked, but it says David sees the angel stopping at this particular point. When David saw the angel who was striking down the people, he said to the Lord, I have sinned. I, the shepherd, have done wrong. These are but sheep. What have they done? Let your hand fall on me and my family. So I think it's when, at that point, when David is talking to God and says, okay, I'm the one. I'm guilty here, not these guys. Okay. And I guess there's a lesson here about the responsibility of leadership. That it's one thing for you to say, oh, I'm doing this, making this great decision. But if your great decisions, bad decision, your very foolish thing results in 70,000 people dying, you got to go, whoa. So that's a pretty heavy responsibility to have there. On that day, so David, and he sees it stop. Okay. On that day, Gad went to David and said to him, go up and build an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite. So David gets three options: famine, war, or plague. David rules out war, but leaves the other two options open. In the end, 70,000 people die, but Jerusalem was saved. Okay. I forgot what I was going to write at that point, and I didn't realize it. I was going to compare it to something. Compare to Passover. Okay. Yeah, that's good. Compare it to the Passover. Yeah. So David sees the angel and repeats, I have sinned. And it appears, let your hand fall on me and my family. Okay. It appears that David is willing to give up his family for the nation here. Okay. And by giving up his family, one could argue, I don't think it's a huge stretch to say, listen, I'll give up the kingdom. I'll give up all of this to save the family, to save the nation of Israel. That the nation of Israel is more important than I am. And at that point, God said, okay, you've learned the lesson that you need to learn, kind of thing. So the angel stops at the very specific place, Araunah's threshing floor. Now, a threshing floor was where they would bring in the wheat, and usually it was kind of high because they would, when they're separating the wheat from the chaff, they would throw it in the air and some would blow away. And so it was a kind of a wide area, generally pretty flat, okay, pretty valuable, because in Israel, there's not a lot of wide, flat areas, okay? We found a level piece in Israel when we were there several years ago. It was about this big. Okay, that was it. Everything else was just like over there. But if you've ever been there, it's like there's not a lot of flat areas. So threshing floors were hard to come by, right? They have this large area where you could bring in all, and this is what this guy does here. Go up and build an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. So David went up as the Lord had commanded through Gad. When Araunah looked up and saw the king and his officials coming toward him, he went out and bowed down before the king with his face to the ground. And I'm thinking in the back of his head, Araunah sees the king there, sees his officials coming, and he's thinking to himself, it's probably in Hebrew, but he's thinking, this can't be good. This can't be good. This can't be good. Why is the king visiting me? Kind of thing. And that's exactly what he says, verse 21. Why has my lord the king come to his servant? To buy your threshing floor, David answered, so I can build an altar to the Lord, that the plague on the people may be stopped. So David sees this as, okay, to kind of prove and finish up everything, I need to buy this threshing floor. Okay. Araunah said to David, "Let my lord the king take whatever he wishes and offer it up. Here are oxen for the burnt offering, and here are threshing threshers and ox yokes for the wood. Your majesty," Araunah gives all this to the king. Araunah also said to him, "May the Lord your God accept you. But here, you can take it all. Here, go ahead. You can do this. Okay, you can have anything you want." Verse 24. But the king replied to Araunah, "No, I insist on paying you for it. I will not sacrifice to the Lord my God, burnt offerings that cost me nothing." Okay, now there's an interesting concept there. It's like, it's not a sacrifice if it doesn't cost you anything, sort of stuff. I mean, there's a story I've never seen it happen. I've seen variations of it, but not this one, that preacher gives, maybe I shouldn't tell this because maybe Jared's going to do this today. The pastor of the church, a preacher, gives somebody in the audience a large amount of money, let's say $1,000. Gives it to Rebecca. See, I'm going to give you $1,000, and when I say give me the money, you're going to give me the money. And so preacher gets up, says, "Okay, we're going to take an offering, etc. We're going to talk about giving, and say, I want people to give money. Anyone have any money they want to give?" And Rebecca stands up, or somebody a lot like Rebecca, and says, here's $1,000. And people are all impressed. Go, woo, she doesn't have $1,000 to give, and yet she's giving $1,000. And then the preacher says, "Wow, you gave that awfully quick. Why was it so easy for you to give that $1,000? And the person's response was, "Well, it's not my money. It's not my money," kind of thing. And the implication there is that, well, is your money yours or is it the Lord's money? It's not your money. So that's not the direction I'm going with this, but you could, I suppose. But I will not sacrifice to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing. So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen and paid 50 shekels of silver for them. David built an altar to the Lord there and sacrificed burnt offerings in fellowship. Then the Lord answered his prayer on behalf of the land, and the plague on Israel stops. So David buys the land, builds an altar, and the Lord answers David's prayer. David's prayer, typing wasn't my strong point. David's prayer to stop the plague. I could just say that's a typo. That's just an error. I just didn't, to stop the plague. Okay. And that ends the book of Samuel. Now, if you compare this passage, this story with the story in chapter 21, you have some similarities, and you see why they're balanced out. So you have both times is because something the king did. Okay. So in one, it's something Saul did. In David's, it's because of something David did. So both times the king is to blame. So it's an action of the king that's to blame. And then it's David who solves the problem, but at great personal cost. In chapter 21, you've got the 7 descendants of Saul. In chapter 24, you've got the death of 70,000 members, people of Israel, kind of thing. But the kingdom is back. The plague ends. It satiates whatever need the Lord has for judgment there. Okay, so the kingdom is back in order, back on track at the time period. And so one of the other reasons that this is important, that the writer needed to put this story in, is because, again, the angel stops at a very specific place. Okay, and we're not going to get to the point, but much later in Kings, we're going to find out that this spot, this threshing floor, is where the temple is going to be built. So those of us who, the original readers would have known, or would have known, oh, that's the threshing floor of Araunah. That's where the temple was built. That wide, flat, raised up area. And if you've ever been to Israel, you know where the Temple Mount is. It's wide, it's flat, and it's kind of raised up, kind of thing. It's a place up above where everybody can look down and see. So it kind of fills in that. So by the end, so if you start comparing the book, looking at the book from start to finish, at the start of the book, Israel is a collection of a dozen tribes that are coming out of the Judges era without a central area without any kind of central order. There's kind of a loose confederation, but it's kind of and then Samuel comes along. You have a strong leader, and then suddenly you have Saul comes along, and Samuel and Saul create that central kingdom, and so you have that central kingdom, yet it's not following God. And then David comes along, a man after God's own heart. At the time, God says to David, okay, I'm going to make your kingdom, your family is going to be the dynasty of Israel. Okay, and so then you see you have, and so David comes up with a centralized city. So now there's a capital. Okay, there's structure. There's the laws are being codified, kind of thing. You have, and David wants to build a temple. You remember that he wants to build a temple, but he's not. But now he's got the site for it. Okay, and we find out later. We'll find out in Kings that David actually goes and does a lot of the prep work for a temple, but he just doesn't build the temple. He gets the site for it. For all I know, he's got the plans out. I don't know if you guys have, we're talking about this refresh thing going on. I'm here at the school 5 days a week, and every day the place is crawling with someone else who's going to do this or that or that or this, or you look out the window and there's a couple of trustees and they're doing this and they're looking and pointing like this. Or I'll walk into the auditorium and there's a dozen people standing around looking at the floor doing this, that, or the other. Yeah, on Thursday, they were going over the carpet on the second floor at 10:50, right? So Pastor Jarrett was there, Dave Morrow was there, 2 or 3 other people were there, looking at the carpet. They're on the second floor, like near the bathrooms, on there in the middle. And I walked up to Pastor Jarrett. I go, hey, we have a tornado drill at 10 after 11. And Pastor Jarrett says, well, do we need to be out of here? It's like, I don't care whether you're out of here or not. It's just at 11:10, you better be down on the ground with your head over your shoulder, because that's what everyone else is going to be doing, kind of thing. Okay, we'll be out of here. But, just doing a lot of this sort of prep work kind of thing. But this is where they started. And so it gives when anyone past time can look back and see, okay, what does this book tell us about God? What does this tell us about how God relates to people? Well, you look at the life of David, and if you really think, I know we tend to idolize. We kind of tend to look at David as very friendly. We kind of say, oh yeah, he was a man after God's own heart, right? He was a man after God's own heart. That whole Bathsheba thing was a sad, unfortunate mistake, kind of thing. It was bad, but he came back. It's like, as we've been going through, if you've been here, okay, David was a brutal guy, okay? David was a vicious guy at times. David had a lot of issues. In fact, if I look at this, I think David did his best to break the covenant with God. I mean, he really did. Like every time you turn around, David is doing something else, okay? But God never left him. And David centralizes and pictures the nation of Israel. And so somebody who looks to David as the exemplar of their leadership can say, God never left David because of his promise, okay? And if God never left David because of his promise to him, he's never going to leave me because of his promises. Okay, so how do we know that Israel has a future? Why do we believe that Israel has a future? Because God made a promise to Israel. And God made a promise to David. And God had all kinds of opportunities to get rid of David. And he doesn't. Because God is a God that keeps his promises. So what do we know about God? Because again, when it comes right down to it, the Bible is a book about God. Okay? Whatever it's talking about, doesn't matter what. If it's a story, it's a psalm, it's just instruction. It's telling us something about God. And what does Samuel tell us about God? It tells us that God keeps his promises. Yeah, seriously. No. Okay. So, any questions? We're done with Samuel. So we're not the class. Again, there's there's one more epilogue, just sort of a whatever happened to kind of piece, because there's still a few other loose ends to the story that people like me want to know. What happened to that guy? What happened to that guy? Kind of thing. So we're going to spend next week kind of talking about that. Any thoughts or questions on Samuel? All right. I've enjoyed going through Samuel. I mean, I really, you know, every time I pick one of these chapters, it's the same thing. You know, what's your favorite book in the Bible? Whatever one I'm studying right at that moment, kind of thing. Because, you know, I thought when I got out of Luke and Acts, I thought, man, I am never going to like a book more than I like Luke and Acts. And I'm like, here, oh, this Samuel, I just want to go back and start over again. Want to do that? We can go back, because now we all know how it ends. We can kind of go back. You ever do that? You ever watch a movie where it's got all kinds of secret stuff and there's a surprise ending, and then you turn around and you go back and watch it again, knowing how it ends, or you watch a movie and you know how it ends, kind of thing. And now we know how it's going to end. We can look at it and go, oh yeah, I see that, kind of thing. So, all right. Well, thank you for hanging in here with me. If you have any questions, let me know, and I'll see you next week. Good.